Hello there, and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb. Today, I'm joined by just my father, Dr. Scott Keith. We are doing, I think astute listeners would notice that once a year, every year, we have sort of done a State of the Thinking Fellows episode, just you and I. And this actually usually comes out the week after Christmas. And it started off as, in year one, a little transparency, as a total miscount on the episodes that I had pre-recorded. And
funny.
Because we're together for the holiday, for Christmas, it's much easier, and instead of calling Adam and Rod and disrupting their sort of family schedules to come record, it was easy to just say, let me grab the recorder, we'll do an episode right now. And so that's how that started the first year. And then it sort of became, in my mind, just a good idea. The next year, it went well. There's sort of a gamble when you do an episode that isn't normal, that all of a sudden you just lose half your listeners the second I say, hey, this is an episode on the State of the Thinking Fellows. But if you're still listening, if you didn't drop out after the first 30 seconds, I'm going to try to do 3 things on this show, which is include some of our normal theological conversation into this year's State of the Thinking Fellows episode. And we've gained double the amount of listeners that we had since this time last year, is I guess the starting point for this episode. And so there is probably a significant contingent of listeners who have never heard us explain what we mean by the term Thinking Fellows. That doesn't mean that we just think we're
about that in a long time.
That we don't just think we're smart guys, and that's not why the name of the show is that. So we'll probably explain that. I also want to do a more general, the state of 1517 on this episode for listeners, because that relationship has always been close between the Thinking Fellows and 1517. We've always been a 1517 project.
That's right.
But with the introduction of the podcast network, the goal has been to bring that connection back to make the podcasting a core element of what 1517 is and its sort of brand identity, and to also bring people who listen to the podcast to some of the other resources, to invite people who listen to the Thinking Fellows to conferences, to offer them the book resources that we are publishing, to have them to advertise that we have many different types of blogs available for people, so that when people ask us,
how can I find out more about X, Y, or Z?
Yeah, or how can I study the Augsburg Confession further?
Mm-hmm.
We can point them to things like the academies that we do. And so I do want to cover that on this episode too. And so this is probably also an opportunity to, if you're new to the Thinking Fellows, or if you've been listening for a long time, to get an update on the various resources that we have that we think would complement if you're looking for a further theological education, self-education, if you're looking for something specific, that we can direct you that way. So,
awesome.
But why don't we start with, for new listeners, or as a reminder to old listeners, where the name of our show, The Thinking Fellows, comes from?
So when I was asked to come on board to direct 1517, it was at a time when 1517 really needed some definition as to what it was. And working with a few other people, Jeff Mallinson was really instrumental in this at the time, and a couple other of the academics at Concordia University, where we were all working and teaching. What we came up with is that at the end of the day, 1517 is a think tank and a publishing house. So what does a think tank do? Well, they typically produce content on various issues for people to consume, and then engage questions that those people might have in various ways. So at the time, we were very heavily invested in the blog site. And what we started doing was getting the bloggers together to meet once a month to have sort of like an official think tank meeting that we ended up calling the Thinkery. And the people that came to those meetings, initially we would sort of produce some of the things that we were working on and talk about it. It's sometimes still some of that. A lot of it now is it's an opportunity for us to get together and just talk about what's going on and what we're all working on and things like that. But then when I had the idea to start the podcast, and I came to you, seeing if you'd be up for producing it, and what that would mean. The idea that I originally had was to have people that were part of that Thinkery meeting come in as hosts. And so that's how the Thinking Fellows came in. It's not Thinking Fellas. It's not just a group of exclusively guys.
It's people who belong to the
Thinking Fellowship,
at
which are the people,
1517.
the people that are invited to write for us and to write books for us and to speak at conferences, and to podcast, right? And so there's the Thinking Fellows, like a fellowship, like an academic fellowship. And so that's what Thinking Fellows is and was. Originally when we did this, Adam, Francisco, and I were pretty close, and we were neighbors, and so it was really, and he is a historian, and so that made it easy to have sort of a different perspective. And he was available, so Adam was asked to host, and then we really wanted to involve Rod Rosenblatt to sort of get his voice out there more on behalf of 1517. And so Rod Rosenblatt, and then you, and then we still do to this day. We have occasionally people that are also part of that Thinking Fellowship come in.
Yeah, we had Dan Van Vorst came and did that whole series this year on the history of American Christianity, which was great. And he's a member of the Thinking Fellowship. We've had, I think, especially in the early years, anybody who authored a new book and was in the general vicinity, was in Southern California for something,
come on the show.
We would come on the show, and we've still done that. I think if you've been listening all the years and you've noticed a decrease in that sort of thing, that mostly has to do with travel.
It mostly has to do with the expansion of our author base beyond people that live in Southern California.
Yeah.
It's still pretty easy if one of our Southern California authors has a book released to have them on the show. It's more difficult if it's an author that lives in Ohio or Wisconsin. It's sort of there has to be some serendipity involved that they're in the same place you are at a time, so that you can, and that you have recording equipment with you, so that you can get a podcast recorded.
And last January, even, we did, what was it, 4 episodes in a row with different employees from 1517 who have do different things. So we did an episode with Dan Price, who does conferencing, is sort of the main thing. He also is the co-host of 30 Minutes in the New Testament, 40 Minutes in the Old Testament, and is a speaker. But he came in and talked about the importance of conferences on that episode, and what people can take away and what we aim to do at those. Doug Climbera came on the show and talked about the vocation sort of artists, but also the importance for Christians of sort of having a recognizable brand, that when 1517 puts something out on the internet, it's something that people want to read when they see it.
Yep, and he's been doing a lot of reading on Lucas Cranach, and so he talked a lot about Lucas Cranach on that show.
Kelsey Climbera came on and talked about the blog, and talked about...
Didn't she do one on the Heidelberg Disputations too?
Yep, she came on and talked about the theology of the cross, and we talked about atonement and justification. So we've had sort of, we've tried to do that, and then Here We Still Stand. So the big times for us every year to record with other people would be anytime we're at a conference and we have recording equipment. Here We Still Stand. We certainly always get several different people in on those, and then sometimes Christmas, because we do have a Christmas party here in which
California.
Is when those recordings happened last year.
Yeah, and so some of the other academics that work for 1517 and contributors are available and then come on the show.
Again, for the sake of transparency, I get a lot of people say, well, don't you guys have phones? We live in a digital age. You could call anybody.
Yeah, I hear that a lot.
There is a logistical issue that has not to do... Audio quality is part of it, but it's not everything, because a lot of our contributors have mic setups at their homes and things like that. But for us, it's logistically hard to have 4 hosts in a room talking to somebody on Skype, and to make that conversation not have weird gaps in it, not sound disconnected. Part of the Thinking Fellows has been sort of that in-person fellowship.
Yeah.
And so I've stuck to that philosophy when doing the show. And so the interviews have been exclusively in person. and they will likely continue to be that way. Simply because, again, if we called in, we'd have to only have one or two of us here in order to make that conversation actually conversational. If anybody has done call-in meetings for their job before, you can sort of imagine you sit there for most of the meeting sort of quiet while other people talk. And if there's like a large contingent of your coworkers in one place calling in from one place and the rest of you are sort of on individual computers, sort of buying that time to talk and actually engage in the conversation requires a lot of pauses, things that aren't natural conversations.
Well, it's just harder, and we prefer it this way. There are shows on the 1517 Podcast Network that are exclusively
Call in.
like over Skype or whatever. That's just not us.
Yeah, and so I mean that's the answer.
Yeah, I didn't even know it was possible till 5 minutes ago. So,
oh yeah. So yeah, and then again, as a general update, the State of the Thinking Fellows is doing well. Like I said, we doubled the audience this year, which was something I didn't expect to do 4 years in. It's something that we kind of expected the second year, like moving forward, because that was a really fast growing year for us after the first sort of 12 months had gone by. But even at this later stage for us, we see a lot of growth. And I think a thank you to listeners is a big part of that, because we don't run a lot of paid advertising for the shows. We run some limited ads on some podcasting apps and things like that. But for a lot of that growth, it is listeners telling other people, hey, you would like this show.
Yeah, we sure appreciate it. I mean, the impact that we're able to have with this show is, we didn't know what to expect, is what I would say when we started it. We were inexperienced. We didn't really know the possibilities. And so when you don't know the possibilities, you either just think anything is possible and you kind of go wild, or you're a little more conservative like me and you think, what to us would now be very low numbers are extravagant. And I mean, the fact that we are where we are and that people trust us enough to tune in on a weekly basis and hear us just talk to each other is amazing. It's great. We really appreciate it.
Yeah. It's a lot of fun. And I said this during the live show. Podcasts are sort of a way to have conversations or sit in on a conversation. And I know a lot of people, once they've listened to the podcast for a while, really long to not just listen and be part of that. And sort of coming to things like Here We Still Stand has been a way that we've been able to connect with listeners in person and continue these conversations there. Email has also been great. We've had a lot of some of my favorite shows to record come up because somebody sort of asked us a question.
Yeah. And I would say that we all along have intended this show to cover basically history, theology, and apologetics, with philosophy sort of necessarily mixed in there. We have never intended it to do a ton of social commentary or political commentary or anything like that. And we sometimes, people ask us for that, and it's not like we lack opinions in those areas. But really, we try our best to stick to our fields of expertise, to the things that we were trained to do. And that's history, theology, a little bit of philosophy, and apologetics. And so that's what the show sticks to. And it's been fun watching how we still have ideas for episodes, even after 4 years, on those 4 topics. Because it's not like, there are issues that come up, but as the scriptures say, there's really nothing new under the sun on those things. And so you're really sort of finding what people are talking about and what people are interested in.
And we're not trying to have academic conversations, like purely academic conversations either. And so that's again sort of a limiting thing when you're doing systematic theology, for instance, is as we sort of try to broadly cover the categories in the way which we think gets people to the gospel the quickest, gets people to a right understanding the easiest with the least amount of roadblocks, sort of broadening the amount of categories under each subcategory is something we've avoided also. And I think, again, to keep it conversational so that you don't we just don't want people tuning out saying, I don't understand this anymore.
Right.
It's a critique we've had of sort of the practice of theology as a whole on the show is when theologians start talking and nobody else besides the other theologians start understanding, it's not theology for the sake of Christ crucified anymore.
Yeah, well, it's important to listen to your audience too. Sometimes they'll let you know when you're going over their heads, and it's time to reel it in.
Yep. So I hope that we're not just imagining that we're succeeding at this in our heads, and that if we are not, that listeners would keep us accountable by, again, you can contact us through the 17 website, Facebook messages, Twitter, direct messages, those types of things. So that's good. And I think we can move on to the second part of what I wanted to ask, which is you are I don't introduce you like this on the show, so some people may know and some people may not know, but you're the executive director of 1517. Is that the right title?
That is the right
I never use your title, so
nobody else does either. Every time I tell them that, they're like, "Really?" And I'm like, "Yep."
Yeah. And so, could you tell people maybe who have only engaged with the Thinking Fellows of the things among 1517? You alluded to it that when you came on, things were a lot different, smaller.
Yeah, I mean, things
scope.
when I first started, things were a lot smaller than they are now. The scope of what we do was.
And that's not even just that. We're not talking about audience specifically. We're talking about the things.
I'm talking about staff. I'm talking about the events that we host and or sponsor. I'm talking about number of blog sites that we manage and podcasts, and I mean books that we publish. Just everything was smaller at that time. And I came on. I was just looking at it today. I first became involved with 1517 in 2013. Back when it was called 1517, the Legacy Project.
So 6 years ago.
We still love that name too. And there were 2 employees, and I can say for certain that the budget was a lot smaller. And through the years, we've just been, by the support of people who, when they hear the gospel message as it's proclaimed through the writers and the podcasters and the speakers at 1517, it resonates with them, and they support us. And through that support, we're able to grow and expand. And the funny thing is, it's never been my goal to grow and expand. I can honestly say that a lot of it has been very organic. I don't set out with a strategic plan from year to year and say, I'd like us to get from this point to this point. I've got a very good friend who runs a successful business, and I've tried to model a lot of what we do on that. And one of his key things is just to be nimble, to recognize opportunities when they're in front of you, and to recognize when something's not going to work too, and to, don't be afraid to say yes and don't be afraid to say no. And we've tried that, and it's gone incredibly well. I mean, we have 1517, Christ Hold Fast is a part of what we do. Chad Bird's website's a part of what we do. We have 13 podcasts on the podcast network. We do up to 4 regional conferences a year. We do 1 big conference a year. We publish, the last 2 years we've published 12 new titles every year. When I came on board, we had 2 titles. We now have 100 titles in our catalog. It's just, things are happening here. God is blessing us, and people are supporting what we do, and I'm very thankful for that.
Yeah, and you can go to 1517.org to sort of see the main landing for all of those things. The blogs are all held in there. You can see all of the podcasts there. Though if you enjoy podcasts, I would say the best way to get them is on your mobile phone through a podcasting
Yeah, that's where people...
Yeah. And so, we are expanding our YouTube presence in 2020. Which is going to be a good thing too. We've recorded lots of video content that we've sort of put here or there or embedded in certain places, but we're gathering things more broadly under our YouTube channel next year. So you can, if you watch stuff on YouTube already, you can subscribe there. 1517 is the page, and I think again a lot of it is. If you've asked more specific questions or asked to have a deeper dive into particular subjects, we've done a lot of it. If you wanted, you've heard our episodes sort of doing 40 minutes about the history of the Augsburg Confession or the Lutheran Confessions as a whole. We have a whole academy course on that, which is several more hours long than the Think If It Lows episodes on that same subject.
Yeah, that's been fun for me because one of the things I used to do a lot is teach Augsburg Confession history and theology at various churches, and I hadn't done it for a long time. And we did the academy course, and that went pretty well. And then I've been asked to teach on the Augsburg Confession at some local congregations, and have been now, I think, 7 or 8 weeks down at Community Lutheran in Escondido, doing their adult Bible class every Sunday on the history and theology of the Augsburg Confession. And it's been fun to watch that class grow and just take off, and people come in and visit the church, and it's just been great. So I love teaching on the Augustana. It's one of my favorites. It always has been.
Yeah, that's why there's 9 or 10 episodes about it on the Think
probably
If It Lows,
true.
background.
Probably true.
Almost matched by the amount of episodes we've done on the Langton.
No way, really?
I don't know. It's close though, for sure. We've managed to repeat some subjects, but in a way that I don't think feels like we do the same episode over and over again, and so that's been beneficial, and that's good. So 1517, insofar as it's a think tank, deals with theological issues at hand, and like you said, we don't do a lot of social commentary, but we do sort of. We write blogs, we do podcasts, we have conferences that we believe are specifically a response to particular things going on in, I would even say specifically American Christianity, but Christianity abroad as well. And so what I wanted to ask you as part of the closing, the last half of this episode, what do you think the most prevalent theological issues are right now? And what does 1517 do? Or what are we doing to sort of address or speak towards those issues?
I guess I'd say that I think it's been the same problem for a while now, and it's a prevalent problem, and it crosses denominational boundaries, and it used to be just sort of referred to as a broadly evangelical issue, but I don't think that's the case anymore. I think American Christianity is very good at promoting anything but the actual gospel of Christ Jesus. The gospel of Christ Jesus being, of course, the specific message of Christ's death and resurrection for the sinner, for you, right? That Christ lived the perfect life in your stead, or that he was born a man, that he lived the perfect life in your stead, that he said that he was God come to save all people, that he proved that by fulfilling prophecy, by performing miracles, by raising people from the dead, and then on the third day after his death, raising himself from the dead, and that he promises that if you trust in him, that he's the first fruit of your resurrection. And then he promises that he makes other promises that are connected to that he'll send the Comforter, and that this Comforter will bring with him the power of God into salvation, and that he will give you that belief when the gospel is proclaimed, and that's all God working on you and working out your salvation. And American Christianity takes that and tries to figure out how they can work out their own salvation. And the end result is I like to call it list-oriented theology, that what people receive on Sunday morning is not what Christ has done for them and is doing for them and their salvation, through the proclaimed word of the gospel off the preacher's lips to their sinful ears and then into their sinful heart, changing them. It's more what they need to do, and what they need to do as a Christian, to confirm their Christianity in some way, to show that they're a Christian, to perfect their righteousness, to do whatever. And it leads to despair. And it almost certainly leads to despair because it's not the saving word of the gospel. Only the gospel in the text of Scripture brings with it the promise to not only bring a person to the faith, but to keep them in that faith until death. Mm-hmm. That's it. That's the only thing in the Scripture that promises to do that. It's what comes with a beneficial promise. It's why it's the gospel. Promise of forgiveness of sins, life, hope, and all that. And it's the thing that American Christianity on the whole avoids preaching. And it avoids preaching it for the same reason that the Roman Catholic Church did in the 1500s, because it's really worried about if we tell the people that they're free and that they're saved no matter what they've done, they're going to go out and be naughty. They're going to go out, and how will we keep them under control? And church has become about giving people things to do, and by giving them those things to do, keeping them under control.
And I think it's there when you're speaking against this and advocating for sort of the proclamation of the gospel, the renewal towards this. One of the common things I notice is that sometimes it's hard, it's uncomfortable because the language being used broadly is churchy.
Yes,
it
right.
sounds,
and Jesus is in it,
and it's Jesus is in it, and it sounds right if your ears aren't tuned.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound bad. It doesn't sound like it's trying to malign Christ in any way. But the more you pay attention, it's sort of less about, I don't know, the outward look about if it's talking about Jesus or not, and more like what you said, getting down to comfort. What is Jesus being referred to as?
So people will say all the time, well, I just want to try to find a church where they preach Jesus. And I'm like, that's great. That's absolutely great. Be sure they're actually preaching the Jesus of the gospel, though. Because a lot of churches preach Jesus as sort of a moral example for you to follow. And they're still preaching Jesus. They're just not preaching you the salvation that comes through preaching the Christ of the gospel.
Yeah, I had somebody share with me, they heard a preaching, Jesus carried a heavy burden. What does your burden look like? Right?
Yeah.
And that's
preaching Jesus. And Jesus did carry a heavy burden, right? He really did. He carried the heaviest burden. He carried the weight of all of our sin, and he carried it to his death. Yet he rose again, victorious over that sin that he carried to death for us. And that's the gospel, and that he did it for you, and that he did it as the first fruits of your resurrection. And that is the saving power of the gospel. A couple years ago at 1517, it's one of the things that, several years now, it's one of the things that we said, this is what we do. This is what we do. We other things will come along with that, but they're ancillary. But what we do is this: we preach the gospel of Christ Jesus, and the things that support that preaching of the gospel. Right. So evangelism, apologetics. How do we know? All those things come along with it. The history and the theology of the church through the ages. How has the church proclaimed the gospel through the ages? Those are all part of it. But the pointing in the stick for 1517 is the proclamation of the gospel of Christ Jesus for the sinner.
Yeah. And the Thinking Fellows is obviously not a sermon. We have a podcast that are sermons. It's You Are Forgiven Radio. You can go check it out. It's, I think, a prime example of sort of that distribution of Christ in church. And it's, I like to tell people it's not a replacement for church. But it's a way to tune your ears. It's a way to, if you've not been getting the comfort of Christ somewhere and you want to supplement that you can listen to. But
this is what the Augsburg Confession says the church is. Yeah. The church is that place where the gospel is preached faithfully and the sacraments rightly administered. I mean, literally, one of the reasons I love the Augustine is because the message about what the church is and is doing is so clear. It's so clear. It's not muddled at all. If the church is that place where the sinner goes to get the forgiveness of Christ, that is the gospel. Church is that place where the sinner goes to get the gifts given to him as Christ instituted in the sacraments. That's the church, and it's clear. We make the church and Christianity less clear. The reason that it gets confusing for us is because specifically Christ, he cleared it up so much. The way to salvation is me. You want to know the Father, know me. You want to know how to get to heaven, know what I've done for you.
Yeah, and it's shockingly, in the New Testament and Jesus' earthly ministry is really apparent to this. It's shockingly easy in the name of sort of religious sanctity to get in the way of of him. Of just it is just me, part of that, and again, that's what makes being in this space sort of hostile sometimes too, is that because it seems like you're talking about what would otherwise sound like good and sanctified things.
Yep.
I sometimes feel, I don't know if this is true, but I sometimes feel like in the realm of political commentary that this is easier because it's harder. Like, we try to do this without demonizing other Christians. It's easier to sort of demonize like a political enemy,
opponent,
because you don't want to, you don't want to demonize somebody who, you think you could actually teach to acknowledge the difference between what has been said in the actual proclamation of Christ.
It's funny. Ron Hodel is our chaplain, and basically he's chaplain for our staff and our staff meeting and our board meetings and things like that. Available at our big conference to be a chaplain to people who need a pastor to talk to. But he said it again today. He said, "I spent 30 years figuring out how to preach the same thing every Sunday." And that's kind of what we do, right? We spend every day trying to figure out how to say the same thing in a way that's engaging and meaningful.
Yeah, and that's kind of funny. The same thing goes back to the idea that we have in the word confess. When we confess, we say the same thing back to God, that thing which He has said to us. And so the whole Christian life, Luther says this, the whole Christian life is one confession. We're confessing those things back to God, that we are poor, miserable sinners, and that He has saved us.
That's right.
And those are,
we're confessing to Him those things He already knows.
It's quite boring because you're the theology which Christ offers us is
the same every day.
It's the same every day, and it's quite limited.
Yep.
And so
it doesn't leave a lot of room for what you do.
And then that leads us to sort of try to fill with our imaginations often. And I think one of the things we try to do with the Thinking Fellows is just check that. Ask that question: are we filling it in here?
Yeah.
Where has it been filled in the past in history, so that we know what that looks like in the future?
How's this been said clearly before?
Yeah.
How do we understand and know these things?
Is there a philosophical or epistemological grounds under which these occur more often?
Yeah. How do we share this message with others? How do we defend this message when it's opposed? Mm-hmm. All those things.
So I really do hope that listeners. I think because we have not lost all of you, that there are people who acknowledge that. It's not just a guess, but if this has been beneficial, this is the time of the year where we are preparing financially for 2020.
That's right.
At this point, and it's really important. And we try the podcasts are all a free resource.
Most of what we do, unless you buy a book off the website or Amazon, most of what we do is free.
Yeah, we try to keep as much as possible free. And the Thinking Fellows, as long as it's around, will be free.
Yep.
And in order to do that, though, we have to get listener support to do that, which has always been a struggle in the past. I'll be honest, it's a struggle in the past because you sort of ask either at the beginning or the end of an episode, you don't know how many people hear it. Somebody hears it in the car and then wants to donate and then gets to work, has a long day at work and gets home, and sort of you space it. And we try not to nag every episode saying, give us your money, give us your money, give us your money, because we're not trying to get your money. We're trying to meet a budgetary need in order to continue the show, essentially.
Yeah.
And so if you have benefited from the Thinking Fellows, from other projects at 1517 in any way, now is a really good time to start the support if you've intended to. And we would really appreciate it. That, especially if you're listening to the podcast, affordable monthly recurring donations are extremely significant to us because it helps us see and have renewed continued support throughout the year. And I think it's easier too than asking for a giant chunk of your
And
your
like
paycheck
we've said before, we appreciate your support. If you think what we're doing is valuable, and you think it's valuable that we try to offer it to everybody at no cost, and you can't afford to support us, please consider not only praying for us, not only telling people about what we do, not only rating our podcast, all of which help us, but supporting us financially to the amount that you can afford.
Yeah. And again, if you no amount is like insignificant. We appreciate even just seeing somebody's name come through as somebody who stands with us in order to try to get the Thinking Fellows and get the gospel, particularly get the gospel out to more people. And that's essentially what we're trying to do with this show. We're gonna continue to try to do that in 2020. I would love to hear more from listeners. We've transitioned websites. So we used to have a contact form specifically for the Thinking Fellows when we had a standalone website. Now, if you go to the 1517 page, there is a contact button in the navigation menu. If you click that and you type in Thinking Fellows in the subject matter, that gets to me. And so then we can still answer questions. We would love to hear your feedback. If you have comments even about the show, not just questions, but comments about the show. If you've been impacted by it, it's a great encouragement for us to see, because again, while you guys are probably familiar with hearing our voices, which is still a weird concept to me when I meet people, we don't always get to hear back from you, and so it's nice to engage in that conversation with other listeners. I really enjoy it. I enjoy responding to those emails. So again, I don't know. I just want to say thank you. This episode is an attempt to update people and have a thank you. The Thinking Fellows is doing alive and well. I don't want to scare anybody into thinking it's not going to be here in 2020. It is going to be here in 2020, all of 2020. And again, thank you.
Oh yeah, the good news about supporting the Thinking Fellows in 1517 in general is that your support, we can honestly say your support goes directly to the projects, and to make sure that we can continue to offer as many resources as possible, resources that proclaim the gospel of Christ Jesus, and we can continue to offer them to as many people as possible, and that your support goes directly to doing that.
Yeah, it doesn't pay us, I guess, is at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And so that's, I think that's a good thing for people to know as well. So anything else to add before we close out the show?
No, that's it. We appreciate your support. Thank you for supporting Thinking Fellows in 2019. Thank you for supporting 1517 in 2019. Keep an eye out to 1517.org, 1517.org to see what's coming next.
All right. We'll catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.